If you have made it with me to part 2 of Campbell's book, I know you are serious about Greek grammar. This part will be similar in that we are going to discuss linguistic principles alongside Campbell's analysis. But we are going to go deeper into a few passages in order to see how exegesis is affected by adopting Campbell's position, or that found within linguistics. So let's dive in. Chapter 6 begins with terminology. So I again briefly want to point out the differences between how Campbell uses the terms actionsart and implicature and how linguists use them. Again, this is not to beat a dead horse, but to help clarify terms and meaning at the outset. As I try to do in my evaluation of part 1 of Campbell's book, I will try to evaluate Campbell using his own definitions of terms. Campbell opens part 2 by saying that verbal aspect operates in cooperation with various lexemes to produce actionsart expression, also known as implicature. For Campbell, then, actionsart is the final interpretation of a verb in context. And if I am understanding him correctly, implicature would be a more general term to refer to any sort of interpretation in context, not just the interpretation of a verb. I mentioned in part 1 that Campbell's use of terms here is not super important, in that we both have the same theoretical categories, even if we use different terms for them. But it is worth clarifying how linguists would use the same terms, because they do use these terms differently. In linguistics, actionsart refers to the temporal structure of the verbal description. It is also sometimes called lexical aspect, whereas verbal forms like the present or perfect are called viewpoint or grammatical aspect markers. The term verbal aspect, found in the title of the book and popular among New Testament scholars, is typically not used in linguistics, and the reason is simple. The term verbal aspect could be referring to either actionsart or lexical aspect, or viewpoint or grammatical aspect. I will not go through introductory textbooks, ChatGPT, Wikipedia, and whatever other sources to prove that linguists define actionsart in the way I am describing. But I could. We will suffice ourselves, though, instead, with just one example. In Paul Krager's semantics textbook, which can be accessed free online, he describes actionsart as the kinds of situations that speakers may want to describe. Thus, actionsart refers to the temporal nature of the event before that event description combines with any aspectual or tense markers. In Campbell's definition, he makes actionsart the interpretation of the clause after tense and aspect combine with the situation description. Again, Campbell's system would have two different actionsart values for Ed was building a Lego house and Ed built a Lego house. The former would be that the event is in progress, while the latter would be something like a summary view, again, using his terms. However, in linguistics, we would say that these two sentences have identical actionsart values. Both event descriptions refer to an event with a natural endpoint. That is, both are telic. When explaining the actual data, I will use the terms interpretation or use to refer to what Campbell calls actionsart, and I will use actionsart as it is used in linguistics to refer to the event description. When Krager discusses different situation types, he says that we are interested in those distinctions which are linguistically relevant. So it is important to have linguistic evidence to support the distinctions that we make. What does he mean by distinctions that are linguistically relevant? Essentially, these are distinctions in meaning that are reflected in the grammar of the language. That is, they are grammatically significant. The issue is that if we compare any two verbs, there are all kinds of distinctions we can make between the two eventualities they refer to. For example, while eat refers to ingesting something solid, drink refers to ingesting a liquid. This is a distinction between the two eventualities that the verbs refer to. But is this linguistically relevant in any way? It is not. Both verbs can be found with all the different verbal forms in English. For example, I drank, or was drinking, or had drunk, or had been drinking, as well as I ate, was eating, had eaten, and had been eating. Likewise, both verbs allow for the object to be dropped, as in I'm eating versus I'm eating bread, and I am drinking versus I am drinking water. Clearly, eat and drink do not refer to the same event, but the distinction in meaning between the two is not linguistically relevant in the sense that both verbs interface with the grammar of English in the same way. Thus, the meaning distinction between eat and drink is not grammatically significant. The two verbs would fall into the same actionsart category. In chapter 6, Campbell again does not interact with the literature on actionsart or lexical aspect, and in failing to do so, he does not take into account the work that has already been done to develop categories that are linguistically relevant. Campbell's system is idiosyncratic in a number of ways and does not use linguistic tests to distinguish between the different kinds of verbs. For example, he defines transitive not as having a syntactic object in accusative case, but as an object being affected or impacted somehow. Again, I will not critique how he is using the term transitive, and I recognize that it is used differently in different circles within linguistics. It should be noted, though, that under his definition, even a predicate like hear the music is not regarded as transitive because the object is not affected or impacted. However, the deeper question is, what does this distinction give us? Do we see transitive Greek verbs, in Campbell's sense, interacting with the verbal system in a fundamentally different way than, say, intransitive verbs? This was the motivation for the distinction between, for example, stative versus eventive verbs in English. Whereas an eventive verb is fine with the English progressive, such as Olivia is drinking milk, stative verbs are not, such as Olivia is knowing math. Thus, the meaning distinction between drink and know affects how the verbs are used within the grammar of English. This tells us something about the meaning of the English progressive, as well as states like know. For each of the meaning distinctions Campbell cites, we would want to see similar such grammatical consequences. Otherwise, we could multiply meaning distinctions endlessly, and they would not help us to understand the verbal forms. Besides the issue of what the categories are, there is also the issue of the imprecision with which the categories are defined and how that affects the categorization of verbs. To illustrate, the verb haptomai, touch, is labeled as transitive, but something that is merely touched is not really affected or impacted. Again, the trouble is that without a more precise definition of what it means to be affected or impacted, it is hard to know how to categorize the individual verbs. I'm not trying to be nitpicky here. Even of the small set of verbs Campbell treats, there are several which I would personally categorize differently based on Campbell's short description, such as heurisco and zdeteo, where again, Campbell labels them transitive, though there is nothing that is affected or impacted. Because of this imprecision, there are verbs which Campbell himself labels as transitive/intransitive, like blepo, akuo, and agapao. Let me summarize the two fundamental issues with chapter 6 then. We need to develop categories that affect the interpretation of the clause when combining with certain verb forms. And we need to be precise about those categories in order to know how to do the actual categorizing. To illustrate how this is done within linguistics, we can compare and contrast Campbell's description of what it means for a verb to be punctiliar with that of linguists. Campbell subsumes punctiliar under transitive verbs, which means that he is defining it as only applying to verbs with an affected argument. He says, if a lexeme is transitive, it may also be punctiliar. A punctiliar action is performed upon an object and is instantaneous in nature. It is a once occurring, immediate type of action. There are two components to this definition. One is that the action is performed on an object, and the other is temporal, namely that there is no duration. We have already suggested that the former is not a good feature for analyzing the temporal structure of verbs, because whether or not an object is affected is not relevant to the meaning of the aspectual forms. It is not as if the class of transitive verbs, in Campbell's sense, are only found with the aorist, or get a special interpretation in the present. However, punctiliar, or instantaneous events, do get a special interpretation in many languages. Consider the following contrast in English. Rhoda is arriving at platform 9 3/4 versus Rhoda is looking at platform 9 3/4. Crucially, these two sentences differ in what they entail, which is another way of saying they have different interpretations. When the progressive form combines with arrive, it does not entail that the event actually took place. We cannot conclude that Rhoda arrived at platform 9 3/4. This is seen by the fact that we can cancel the sentence with something like, Rhoda was arriving at platform 9 3/4 when she was suddenly attacked by a hippogriff. She never made it to the platform. In contrast, when we say Rhoda was looking at platform 9 3/4, we can conclude that Rhoda did indeed look at the platform. It is a contradiction to say Rhoda was looking at platform 9 3/4, but she never saw it. Because we cannot cancel this inference, it is what we would call an entailment. There are two grammatically significant meaning components to arrive that make it differ from look. It does not have any duration, one, and it is telic. That is, it has a natural endpoint. Once Rhoda reaches platform 9 3/4, the event of her arriving at the platform is over. Crucially, the prediction with this analysis is that all verbs with these features should behave in the same way with the progressive. This is what makes such an analysis powerful and helpful in exegesis. We can begin to predict the interpretation of the sentence by noticing features of the predicate and how verbs with such features interact with verbal forms. This prediction is borne out with similar verbs like reach. To say Rhoda was reaching the summit of Mount Doom does not entail that she reached the summit. She may have decided to turn back just before actually reaching the summit. The linguistics literature is replete with similar examples, with similar verbs, and extensive discussion on what is going on semantically. If you are more interested, you can check out Susan Rothstein's chapter on progressive achievements in her book, Structuring Events, for an extensive discussion on what is going on semantically. This data is not just relevant for the English progressive. It also helps us to understand Greek. In my review of part 1 of Campbell's book, I said that the Greek imperfective is not the same as the English progressive, whereas the English progressive must refer to only part of an event. The Greek imperfective forms, the present and the imperfect, can refer to either part of an event or the entire event, particularly when that event has no duration. With the English progressive, a sentence like Rhoda was arriving cannot refer to Rhoda actually having arrived somewhere. Because the Greek imperfective only overlaps partially with the English progressive, we should expect this reading with telic verbs without duration, but we should also expect a reading that is essentially equivalent to the aorist. Again, this prediction is borne out in a verb like gidomi, give. In this verb, there is necessarily a transfer of possession, and when this takes place, the event is over. Hence, it is telic. There is also no real duration. Transfers happen when one thing moves from being possessed by one individual to being possessed by another individual. This happens instantaneously when something is actually exchanged. We see an example similar to the English progressive in Mark 15:23, where we read, Kai edidun auto es munismenon oinon. And they were giving him wine mixed with myrrh. The next line says, Hoste uk elaben, but he didn't take it. In other words, the transfer of possession never took place. In this example, the aorist form of the sentence is not entailed. We cannot conclude, Edokan auto oinon. They gave him wine. The end of the event is never reached. In contrast, we have the same verb earlier in Mark 8:6, where it is used in the description of the feeding of the 4,000. It says, Kai labon tus hepta artus, eucharistesas eklasen, kai edidu tois matetais autu, hina paratithosin. And after taking the 7 loaves and saying thanks, he broke them and started giving them to his disciples so that they could pass them out. Notice this sentence does entail that the event of giving took place, even if it only refers to the beginning of the event and not the end, as my translation suggests. We can truthfully say, Edoken ho Iesus artus. Jesus gave loaves. Thus, this reading entails that Jesus did indeed engage in the giving event. Given the nature of the verb didomi and the semantics we have given to the imperfective, this ambiguity is predicted, and it is reflected in the data. Coming back to Campbell, we can see how his categories for verbs do not always help us to determine the meaning of a verbal form in context. We need the category of punctiliar, but we do not want to subsume it under transitive, whether that is Campbell's definition of transitive or the more standard syntactic one of taking an argument in accusative case. Campbell's feature, plus or minus transitive, does not help us to interpret verbs. The features developed in linguistics, specifically plus or minus durative, plus or minus telic, and plus or minus dynamic, do help us to interpret the verbal forms. As with other things we have discussed, these features have been nuanced, but they go back to the philosopher Zeno Wendler's categorization of events in 1957, and they are still widely used today, especially in introductory works. The chart found in Paul Krager's book serves as an example, and more discussion can be found there. Campbell essentially has the durative feature, which is plus or minus punctiliar, as well as the dynamic feature, which is plus or minus dynamic. But subsuming punctiliar under transitive and stative/dynamic under intransitive obscures the issues and leads to the wrong analysis. Lacking the feature plus or minus telicity is also a large omission, as this feature has arguably received the most attention in the literature and is an essential part of any analysis of lexical aspect. Chapters 7 through 9 in Campbell's book are all very similar. The basic structure of each chapter is to go through the uses of each of the forms and provide a sort of formula for how to get the use by combining the semantics of the verbal lexeme with the semantics of the verbal form to get the interpretation. We will not go through every example, but I have picked uses from the imperfect, perfect, and present forms in order to demonstrate how to think through the issue of interpretation as a linguist would. As I said in my review of part 1, the details matter. We go into detail on a few passages in order to contrast Campbell's analysis with that of modern linguistics. The 3 forms we discuss will demonstrate 3 linguistic or interpretive exegetical principles, namely compositionality, not reading meaning into the text or eisegesis, and mapping Greek onto English or another language, or in other words, translation. Again, it is important to clarify terms before we begin. Campbell has 4 boxes in the examples. He has semantics, lexeme, context, and actionsart. Adding the first 3 is supposed to give you the 4th box, namely actionsart. In linguistics, we would do something similar, but we would call the lexeme box actionsart or lexical aspect, and the semantics box is really the semantics of the verbal form, which would include viewpoint or grammatical aspect and tense, among other potential categories. The context would be taken into consideration, but it would be done in a more systematic way. The question with the context is, again, what does it actually refer to? We would want to be very specific about which meaningful elements in the context are affecting the interpretation of the form and why they are doing so. Let me say at the outset that I think Campbell's approach here is correct. He is basically treating the semantics of the verbal forms like a math problem. If you add the semantics of the verbal form to the semantics of the predicate and also add whatever else is relevant in the context, you should end up with the correct interpretation. This seems to be Campbell implicitly supporting the foundational idea of compositionality in semantics, which the mathematician philosopher Gottlob Frege first articulated and applied to natural language in the late 1800s and early 1900s. The idea of compositionality is that the meaning of a complex expression is equivalent to the meaning of the individual parts and how they combine. Let's illustrate with a simple example. A word like dogs is a complex expression in that it is made up of 2 morphemes, or meaningful elements. There is the word dog plus the plural morpheme s. The way we determine the meaning of this complex expression is by taking the meaning of dog and combining it with the meaning of s, which yields more than one canine in this case. What makes compositionality so powerful is that it allows us to predict the meaning of a new complex expression. For example, you might not know what a flabbit is, but when I say the complex expression flabbits, you know that there are more than one of whatever flabbit might refer to. This prediction comes from the idea of compositionality. By assigning a value to each individual morpheme, and by combining morphemes in similar ways, we can determine the value of new complex expressions. Again, this is a foundational semantic concept that I think Campbell gets essentially correct, though he does not spell out the principle itself. Obviously, this idea gets much, much more complex, and there is a lot of literature about it in semantics, but without compositionality at some level, language would not work. Some within New Testament studies don't like to view language this way. So again, I think it is all the more important that Campbell's method is affirmed here. As an anecdote, I remember Nijay Gupta's response to a tweet Matt Bates made about my Pistis Christou paper when it first came out. He said something like, "Language is not a math formula." I don't remember exactly what he said, but something like that. And look, I have nothing against Nijay, but this does fly in the face of everyone working in the field of formal semantics. There is a reason why the best semanticists in the world often work at MIT or have their PhD from there. In many ways, language really is just a very complex math problem. Now, I do not have an issue with the fact that Campbell is doing math, but I do have an issue with his equations. This brings us to the first verbal form to be discussed in this section, namely the imperfect and the conative use. We already gave the example from Mark 15:23, where Jesus is unsuccessfully given wine mixed with myrrh. Campbell lists this as a conative imperfect, or one that was not accomplished. We said that, indeed, that is the meaning here. This interpretation is generally accepted. Wallace lists the same verse in his grammar. Kostenberger, Merkel, and Plummer list the same verse in their intermediate grammar, and if there was another intermediate grammar in my vicinity, they would probably agree as well. And this is why I think many people struggle to find value in yet more discussions of the verbal system. If we all agree on the interpretation, what are we still doing talking about the meaning of verbs? The utility in talking about how we got to the interpretation is that it allows us to predict the meaning in novel or debated contexts. This is the principle of compositionality in action, and it is where Campbell's formulas matter. Everyone agrees that Mark 15:23 is a failed giving attempt. It explicitly says Jesus didn't take the wine. But how can we predict this meaning in other, less clear contexts, and not read the meaning into wrong contexts? Campbell's formula for the conative interpretation is as follows. Imperfective aspect and remoteness in verbal form plus non-stative lexeme plus attempt unsuccessful in context equals conative actionsart. Campbell defines imperfective aspect spatially. He has said that imperfective aspect gives a more detailed view of the event, while remoteness gives supplemental information. According to the equation, this can combine with any non-stative lexeme and yield the attempt unsuccessful interpretation. Notice in Campbell's equation that he essentially gives the correct interpretation in the context box. What he calls the actionsart, in this case conative, is really just the technical name for the interpretation he already supplies in the context. So basically, when the context denies that an action took place, the attempt was unsuccessful. This is rather obvious. The question that Campbell inadequately addresses is how adding a form that gives a more detailed view of supplemental information to a non-stative lexeme would allow for this interpretation in the first place. In other words, it is not clear how all the things on the left side of the equation would add up to the connotative interpretation on the right side of the equation, other than the very obvious fact that if something in the context explicitly denies that the action took place, it didn't take place. Our question is why this particular predicate and verbal form allow for what would otherwise be a contradiction. Why is the imperfect form used for this interpretation and not the aorist? Our semantics of each of the elements in the sentence does explain this. The imperfective form specifies that one stage of the event took place. We know from languages like English that it is possible to refer to a pre-stage of an event with forms like the progressive, particularly when there is unintentional agent involved in the event. We already saw this in the sentence, Rhoda was arriving at platform 9 3/4, where the only stage of the event did not actually hold. The progressive, therefore, must only refer to a pre-stage of the actual event itself. The verb didomi only has one stage, namely the transference of possession. In Mark 15:23, the pre-stage of this event is referred to, and this satisfies the requirement we have given for the imperfective, which requires a single stage. The pre-stage here is the subject's attempt to give the wine. We will come back to why this particular event description allows reference to a pre-stage momentarily, but the possibility of referring to a pre-stage is why the imperfective is not contradictory and why the aorist would be contradictory. The imperfective can refer to this pre-stage, but the aorist cannot, since it requires the endpoint of the event to have been reached. In other words, this offers an explanation for how we arrived at the actual interpretation. An imperfective form requiring one stage plus a verb that has one stage but allows for reference to a pre-stage equals a possible reference to the pre-stage of that event. In other words, a possible failed attempt of the event itself. Since the next line specifies that the event did indeed fail, that is the correct interpretation. This analysis predicts that this interpretation is only available where a pre-stage of the event is possible. Work by linguist Fabian Martin has shown that agentivity is the key meaning component required for reference to the pre-stage of an event in uses like the conative. A quick look at the data seems to suggest that this is indeed the case. All of Campbell's examples, as well as all of Wallace's examples, as well as all of Kostenberger, Merkel, and Plummer's examples of the conative interpretation involve an animate subject. Why would an agentive human subject allow for this pre-stage use? When the subject is a person, that person can think about engaging in an event or attempt to engage in an event and fail. Reference to this pre-stage is not possible with inanimate subjects because they do not think about engaging in events and cannot attempt actions. Again, the Greek data reflects this. The imperfect of didomi is found with inanimate subjects in the New Testament, but it never receives the conative interpretation where only the pre-stage of the event is referred to. For example, in the parable of the sower, it says that some seeds, edidu karpon, ho men hekaton, hode hexe konta, hode triakonta, produced fruit, some 100-fold, some 60, and some 30. Notice this statement entails that some fruit was actually produced by the seed. The connotative interpretation of a failed event is impossible. When the imperfect is used in this context with an inanimate subject, the connotative interpretation cannot hold. Our analysis predicts this. This deep dive into one particular interpretation contrasts Campbell's equation with how linguists would analyze this and illustrates the importance of the principle of compositionality. Whereas Campbell says that adding something spatial to a transitive verb might equal a possible failed attempt, we have given a real explanation for what is going on. A failed attempt is just reference to a pre-stage of the event actually having taken place. We have given the conditions for reference to a pre-stage, an event with an animate subject. We have said there is only one verbal form that does not require the end of the event to be reached in Greek, and that is the imperfect. Thus, we predict that this interpretation is available for the imperfect form and not for the aorist when the pre-stage of the event is present based on the conditions we have given for it. If we are unable to infer from the context that the end of the event has been reached, we may interpret it as a failed attempt. All of that is just to demonstrate how compositionality works with a real example. Of course, we cannot do this with every example, and I'm sure you wouldn't want me to, that Campbell gives. But honestly, we do not really have to. We have already said that his equations are necessarily wrong because aspectual forms are not spatial. We showed that in detail in part 1, and we have shown how his equation does not work with the connotative interpretation. Before getting to the perfect and present forms and their examples, I want to give a high-level overview of the set of interpretations that Campbell gives as options for each of the forms. As I mentioned earlier, everyone agrees that there is such a thing as a connotative interpretation of the imperfect, and everyone agrees, for the most part, on the verses that serve as good examples. But there is even more agreement than this. Despite Campbell giving a rather novel theory, rejecting temporality completely from the semantics of the verbal forms, he has more or less the same set of interpretations as everyone else for the verbal forms, and they are all temporal. For the present form, he gives progressive, stative, iterative, nomic, and historical present. All of these are temporal interpretations. The progressive is a dynamic event happening during the reference time. The stative is a state holding during the reference time. An iterative is a series of punctual events occurring during the reference time. The nomic is an event that occurs regularly during the reference time. And the historical present is when the temporal anchor has shifted to a past time in the story. Likewise, the interpretations given for the imperfect are all temporal, namely the progressive, stative, ingressive, iterative, and connotative. We have already defined progressive, stative, and iterative temporally. And the only difference with the imperfect is that they are in the past. The ingressive refers to the initial temporal boundary of an event. And we have said that the connotative refers to the pre-stage of an event. We could do the same for all the other interpretations of the verb forms. My main point here is simple. If one side of Campbell's equations namely the interpretation, is necessarily a temporal value, then the other side must also be a temporal value. That's what an equation is. It says that two distinct sets of values are equal even though they might be arranged or look differently. But we cannot jump categories. If the interpretation is always temporal, as Campbell's interpretive categories suggest, then the things that lead to that interpretation must also be temporal. This brings us to our second main point here. Once we have defined a verb form, it is easy to read that meaning category back into the data. I see this happen all the time with the imperfect form. People wrongly think that it is just like the English progressive, and then they try to force an interpretation that would reflect that. However, as we explained in part 1, the imperfect is not equivalent to the English progressive. So that initial categorization is incorrect. And it would be wrong to read in the meaning of the English progressive into every Greek imperfect. Campbell does the same thing with the Greek perfect, which he calls an imperfective. He has wrongly called the perfect an imperfective, and he wrongly equates the imperfective with a progressive in English. He then claims that there is a progressive use of the perfect. Again, this is where the categories and definitions matter because they are being read into the data. Campbell lists the following verses as examples of the progressive perfect. Mark 7:37, John 17:6, Acts 21:28 and 25:11, 1 Corinthians 7:15, 2 Timothy 4:7, and Jeremiah 1:12. None of these should be understood as a progressive, which Campbell defines, rightly, as a process or an action in progress. Let us briefly consider 3 of these examples. I do not cover them all for the sake of time, but after going through several, you can hopefully see how the others would be treated. In Mark 7:37, a crowd exclaims about Jesus that "Kalos panta papoyeken, kaitus ko fus poyei akuein, kaitus alalus lalain." Campbell translates the initial perfect pepoyeken as "he does everything well," which in English would really not be a progressive interpretation, but a habitual. Campbell does not explain why this would be a progressive, but it seems to be the following clause, which gives the thing that Jesus does habitually, namely, heal different kinds of people. However, the crowd is responding to a healing. It makes far more sense to interpret this perfect form as perfect aspect. There was a past event that was relevant to this present statement. The crowd claims that all the things Jesus has done, he has done well. They then make a general statement about what he does based on what he has done. He makes both the deaf hear and the mute speak. This general statement does not mean he is in the process of doing these things, as the progressive interpretation would suggest. It means he has the characteristic of doing these things. The perfect, which precedes that general statement, is a recognition that he has just done them. In John 17:6, we have the perfect tetere kan in kai ton logon su tetere kan. Again, Campbell translates this with the simple present in English. And they keep your word. Just like Mark 7:37, this translation does not reflect a progressive interpretation, but a habitual in English. Jesus' disciples, whom he is praying for, habitually keep his word, at least according to Campbell's translation. But again, the perfect interpretation, translated, "they have kept your word," is best here. 2 verses later, Jesus speaks of his words, which he gave to them, and which they received, both clearly referring to past events. Moreover, it says that they believed that Jesus was sent by God. In context, then, Jesus is talking about things that the disciples have done leading up to this moment. They are not currently keeping God's word as Jesus is praying for them, which would be the progressive reading. They have kept his word in the past, and this is relevant now in Jesus' prayer. Finally, 2 Timothy 4:7 is one where Campbell actually does translate the perfect forms as progressives. The verse says, ton kalon agona egonismai, ton dromon teteleka, ten pistin tetereka, which he translates as, I am fighting the good fight, I am finishing the race, I am keeping the faith. Again, no explanation is given here, but the assumption is that Campbell interprets these clauses as a progressive because Paul has not actually fought the fight completely or finished the race or kept the faith for his whole life. He is technically still alive. However, this misunderstands Paul and does not adequately consider the meaning of the previous verse, in which Paul says, Kaiho kairos tes analuseos mu ephesteiken, and the moment of my departure has become imminent. The point is that Paul's fight is effectively over. He thinks he is about to die. There is no more fight left. There is no more race to run. The faith has been kept throughout his life as a follower of the Messiah. The progressive interpretation would suggest that Paul still has more fighting left to do, and his race is not effectively over. But he has said in the previous verse that he is already being poured out as a drink offering. The point of using the perfect forms here is to signal that Paul does indeed view his race as over. He has done everything he has been called to do. His time to die is now here. There is nothing left for him to do. The perfect gives you that meaning precisely. The progressive gives you the wrong interpretation. It says that Paul is still running the race and is not necessarily about to die. Once again, the traditional perfect offers a better explanation here. My point in bringing up these examples is that it is easy for scholars, myself included, to read our definitions of the verbal forms into potentially ambiguous examples. Campbell calls the perfect form an imperfective. He equates the imperfective with the English progressive. He knows that the English progressive has a use where it refers to a dynamic event in progress. So, logically, the perfect form should have this use as well under his system. This meaning is then read into context. This is where the meaning we ascribe to the verbal forms actually makes an interpretive difference. Either Paul is saying that he has finished the race, or he is saying that he is in the middle of the race, but he is not saying both. My claim is that Campbell has interpreted Paul wrongly here because of his theory about the perfect. I demonstrated at length in my review of the first part of Campbell's book that the temporal definition of the perfect as referring to an event or state that precedes the reference time best accounts for the data. It also best accounts for these verses as well, which Campbell says should be understood as progressives. Our third and final point for chapters 7 to 9 is how to map Greek onto English, and we will use the historical present as our test case. Campbell says that there are basically two different types of historical presents, those that introduce discourse and those that employ lexemes of propulsion. I suggest that these two categories, which we will refine, should receive two different explanations, and Campbell also gives two different explanations. For verbs of speaking, he says, historical presents that introduce discourse utilize the present tense form because they are leading into a proximate imperfective context, discourse. In such cases, the proximate imperfective nature of discourse spills over to the verb that introduces it. Of course, the biggest problem with this is when the aorist form eipin is used with no spillover effect. In other words, there are plenty of cases where discourse is introduced by an aorist form. So these would be left unexplained, or at least it is not clear when you would have a present form and when you should have an aorist. For example, John 18:25 says of Peter, Ernesto ekeinos kai eipen uk emi. He denied it and said, I am not. The aorist verb eipen is immediately followed by discourse in this example. So if there was ever a context where we should expect spillover, it would be here. I suggest a different reason why the verb lego, say, is used with the present tense form to introduce direct discourse. First, the fact that it is only lego that is consistently used like this and not other verbs of speaking, such as laleo, suggests that there is something going on with the verb lego and not the present tense form itself. This leads into my suggestion. Lego may be used as essentially a complementizer to introduce a complement clause, similar to the word that. In a number of other languages, the equivalent to the verb say comes to mean something very similar to a quotation marker. Biblical Hebrew is actually one such language, where either vayomer or lemor can both introduce direct speech following another verb of speaking. The way we know that a verb has become a quotation marker and has lost its original meaning is that the verb can follow itself. In Numbers 7:4, for example, we have Vayomer Adonai el Moshe, lemor, where the initial verb said precedes the infinitive to say. A translation of every single morpheme literally would be Adonai said to Moses to say. The reason why this is not redundant is that the final to say no longer means to say. It is just a quote marker. In Biblical Hebrew, the verb vayomer can also have this function of introducing direct speech. An example, like 2 Kings 18:28 says, Vayedaber vayomer. He spoke, he said. Again, the he said here is simply introducing the quote that follows. When you look at the Septuagint of a verse, like Numbers 7:4, we have kai eipen kyrios pros musein legon, where the participle legon is again redundant. This is essentially equivalent to what we have in Matthew 22:1, which says eipen en parabolais autois legon. The point here is that we see the New Testament authors using legon as equivalent to a quotation marker, just as we saw in Hebrew with lemor, and as we find in the LXX, the Septuagint. The parallels go deeper, however. The present form lege often translates the past tense form vayomer in Hebrew, which we have already said can also be equivalent to a quotation marker. But it isn't always. Indeed, though, lege is used in a very similar way in the New Testament in a verse like Luke 13:8, where it says, Hode apokritheis lege auto. But answering him, he says. In English, we do not need the final he says. We can just say, but he answered him, followed by the quotation marker that introduces the quote. In both Greek and Hebrew, the verb say is often used to introduce the quote. Crucially, however, the verb in such contexts is no longer functioning as a verb. It is not giving you the time when the event took place, but it is simply introducing a quote. In semantics, we would call this semantic bleaching. One meaning component of the original verb has been lost when it has taken on another function, namely to introduce direct speech. The point here is simple. The verb lego is not an argument against the present tense being a true present tense. That specific verb has lost its original tense meaning, but that does not mean that the present tense itself has changed its meaning. Let me clarify what I am saying and what I am not saying at this point. In both Greek and Hebrew, say verbs are reanalyzed as complementizers. It could be the case that Hebrew is influencing the Greek of the New Testament authors at this point, but it need not. My friend Noah Basil from Hebrew University, who was a fellow student there, has shown that say verbs become complementizers in a number of unrelated languages, including Marathi, Dakini, Hindi, Urdu, Oriya, and others that I probably will not pronounce well. In other words, this is a known phenomenon across many languages, and there is a reason for it. You can check out her work for the reason if you really want to know. It should come as no surprise then that Biblical Greek and Hebrew do the same thing. Whether or not we have Hebrew influence here really does not matter. The data suggests that semantic bleaching for a certain verb is the best explanation, and the fact that this is found in a number of other unrelated languages confirms this. Campbell says that the other class of verbs where we have the historical present is with verbs of propulsion. This, I argue, is simply not correct. There are clear examples of historical present verbs that cannot fit into the category of verbs of propulsion, which Campbell defines as verbs that convey transition movement from one point to another. One example is the verb blepe, as found in Luke 24:12, which says, "Hode Petros anastas edramen epito mnemeon, kai parakypsas blepe ta othonia mona." But after Peter got up, he ran to the tomb, and stooping down, he sees only linen clothes. Because of examples like these, Campbell's explanation of the historical present, which necessarily makes reference to a transition, cannot be correct. In my review of part 1, we suggested a different explanation for the historical present. The temporal anchor shifts to the time that is being talked about, namely the reference time. This means that the present tense has its normal meaning, since the temporal anchor and the reference time overlap, which is the meaning we gave for the present. This temporal explanation also explains the meaning difference between a normal past tense form and the historical present. When a historical present is used, the speaker's now literally does move to the time of the story itself. It is a different temporal anchor. The narrator essentially brings the addressee with him or her back to the time when the event actually took place. And this shift in time is what gives the historical present its vivid nature. The addressee is now placed at the time of the event and is, in this sense, watching the events unfold. This is the reason why significant events are often placed in the historical present. Luke 24:12 is one such example. By bringing the reader back to the time when Peter sees only the cloths, Luke draws attention to this event in particular. And stooping down, he sees only linen cloths. Campbell says that the historical present should normally be translated as a simple past, but I suggest that this is incorrect. We have the historical present in English as well, and we can just as easily use it to highlight certain events in the narrative. It is true that the verb lego should often receive a past tense translation, or really no translation at all. But this is because, as we have said, it is the verb lego that has a unique meaning and not the present tense. Hence, these are not true examples of historical presence. When we do have true historical presence, it is normally best to translate them as that, historical presence. This draws attention to the parts of the story that the author is drawing attention to. In going into detail on a few points in this section, I hope I have shown that the details matter. The nuances in translation affect our interpretation, and our analyses of the verbal forms affect the nuances we see in translation. Once again, this is longer than I intended, so I will treat the last 2 chapters of the book briefly before discussing the final appendix on Campbell's review of the Greek verb revisited. If you have followed what I have said so far, you can probably see for yourself where I might critique the last 2 chapters. I want to make 2 final points to wrap things up. First, there are several places in the book where English is compared to Greek, and English is normally found lacking in some feature that Greek has. For example, Campbell begins his section on the subjunctive mood with the following statement. Students of Greek often have difficulty working out what meaningful difference there is between aorist and present subjunctives. This is especially the case when we are taught to translate both as I might loose, or some variation of this gloss. If both subjunctives translate this way, why did Greek authors choose one over the other? Why does the language need more than one tense form in the subjunctive mood? The simplest answer is that sometimes languages make distinctions that other languages do not. Now, there is much in this statement that is correct. It is certainly true that different languages make different distinctions. However, what I want to point out is that English actually can make aspectual distinctions when the modal verb might is used. We can say either I might loose or I might be loosing, or even I might have loosed or I might have been loosing. These 4 different ways of expressing the possibility of loosing are all aspectual distinctions. We've already said that English's aspectual system is indeed different from Greek, but we should not be surprised that Greek can make aspectual distinctions in the subjunctive mood. I am sure ancient Greeks would have been bewildered by the 4 different aspectual forms that can all combine with the several different modal forms we have in modern English. Our system is different, but it is certainly not less complex. If anything, it is more. I say this to draw attention to the fact that we have to be more self-reflective about our own language. I am sure Campbell has used the might have been doing combination in his own use of English in his life. I am certainly not suggesting he is bad at using English, but analysis is a different animal. It is much harder to be self-reflective about our own language use, but this would greatly help us in our analysis of other languages, such as Greek. The historical present is another case in point. If English, as well as language after language, has the same construction, we should not be surprised if Greek does. But we should also then carefully consider the best way the Greek historical present maps onto English. Since English does have this use of the present, and it is arguably used to signal a very similar meaning, we should try to reflect this in our translation. And indeed, many times we can if we're thinking critically about how our own language works. All right, we are almost there. I want to briefly go back to the principle of compositionality that I mentioned in the beginning of this video. The principle says that the meaning of a complex expression is equivalent to the meaning of its component parts and how they combine. Campbell himself used the four-box method to try to determine the meaning of a complex expression. And I said that this is indeed the correct way to go about it, even if Campbell's equations were incorrect. When Campbell comes to the non-indicative forms in chapters 10 to 11, he does not define each of the different categories he treats. And he says that the four-box method is no longer relevant. It seems unclear to me, honestly, when I read it, whether he thinks such a method simply does not work for the non-indicative moods, or if he omits the four boxes only for the sake of simplicity, which he does actually mention. Regardless, I propose that thinking compositionally about the meaning is indeed still the correct way to go about the analysis. So when we come to the non-indicative forms in chapters 10 to 11, we would ideally want to see clear definitions for each of the other meaning components. And then we can see how these meaning components combine with the different aspects. For example, we need a definition of the subjunctive. When we combine the meaning of the subjunctive with the meaning of the aorist, with the meaning of the particular verb in whatever context, we should get the meaning of that particular subjunctive aorist verb. Campbell nowhere provides a meaning for the subjunctive, infinitive, imperative, or participle, at least not definitions that are precise and that we can combine with other aspectual forms. I understand that this is an introductory book, so the definition may need to be simplified, but it still needs to be given. We need to know what these things are in order to analyze them. Only in having such a definition can we evaluate whether the theory can make the correct predictions. This is what we are trying to do in semantic analysis. Provide a meaning for each morpheme in a sentence that would correctly predict the meaning of a novel sentence. What makes this complex is that there are a lot of different meaning components that we need to take into account. And it is sometimes difficult to know which meaning components are relevant. We saw this in our discussion of the conative use of the imperfect. That interpretation was only present with certain kinds of verbs, namely achievements, with certain kinds of subjects, namely animate. And we gave reasons why achievement predicates and animate subjects were necessary conditions for that interpretation. Even something like the animacy of the subject can affect the temporal structure of the event being referred to. Language is indeed complex, and the complexity demands our humility. This is evident to all who have ventured into the world of natural language semantics. And so we come to Campbell's appendix on the Greek verb revisited. As I said, for Campbell's review of the field of Greek in chapter 2, I do not want to just evaluate Campbell's evaluation of others. And I am not here to defend one side against the other. However, Campbell does make a few points about linguistics that I want to touch on briefly. If you have stuck with me this far, I promise it will be brief. First, Campbell applauds the volume's common embrace of a cognitive approach. I am not against cognitive linguistics per se, but it is odd that a cognitive approach would be applauded about a book on the verbal system of a language, when it is formal semanticists, not cognitive semanticists, that have done the most work on tense and aspect markers. Since Campbell is endorsing a cognitive linguistics approach, as do the authors of the Greek Verb Revisited, this comment applies to both parties and will get me in trouble with both sides. Within biblical studies, cognitive linguistics is often treated like the dominant, dare I say the only, linguistic paradigm. Again, this is a failure to read the linguistics literature itself. Generative grammar and formal semantics dominate linguistics worldwide. If you Google the best linguistic universities in the world, the top 5, 6 will almost certainly include Stanford, Harvard, and MIT, and they're usually near the top. All of these programs are dominated by formal semanticists and syntacticians, and it is scholars in the formal approaches that have done the most work on tense and aspect. There is a reason why Kai von Fintel, linguist at MIT, says that tense and aspect are the bread and butter of the working semanticist. It's because these are the kinds of things they obsess over. They have given us all the nuanced definitions of tense and aspect that are operative today. If we could describe the main areas of study in both cognitive semantics and formal semantics, the former would be primarily concerned with the meaning of lexical items, a word like cat, and the latter would be primarily concerned with grammatical items, like a tense or aspect marker or a definite marker, like the. If you know the field, you know that there is more to it than this. But that would be the basic split. Tense and aspect markers are grammatical. That is the main domain of formal semanticists. Some such scholars are cited in certain papers in the Greek Verb Revisited. So I am not addressing everyone who wrote those papers, nor am I only addressing Campbell, who is applauding the cognitive approach. And again, I am not necessarily against a cognitive approach. My point here is to address the broader issue within biblical studies, that the field of linguistics is often simply misunderstood. If an outsider to the field of theology or biblical studies looked at how scholars used Hebrew, but they only read the scholars who were, let's say, New Testament theologians, they would get a very skewed view of the field. Hebrew is not really their thing. Some, I'm sure, are good at Hebrew. But in the same way, if you read only scholars working in cognitive linguistics and try to build your definition of tense and aspect off of these scholars alone, you are going to get a skewed view of the field. We should read cognitive linguists, but we also need to read the scholars at Harvard, MIT, and Stanford that are working on tense and aspect. We will come back to this shortly with a real issue that Campbell brings up in this section. Before getting to this, I do want to touch on some of Campbell's claims in section 3 of the appendix entitled The Hegemony of Linguistics. In this section, Campbell essentially argues that linguistics has something to offer, but Greek grammarians may disagree with them and be correct. This is, of course, true. One of the reasons why I have gone through the data in these reviews is that our theories are indeed about how we interpret the data. In theory, Greek scholars may all disagree with linguists about how to define tense and aspect, and they may have a better reading of the data. I have tried to show that this, however, is false. The field of linguistics offers us better tools to understand the data. However, more is being claimed in this section. Campbell says things about the field of linguistics that are false. He says, besides, we, Porter, Fanning, and Campbell, are not naively unaware of alternate definitions of aspect, as found in Bernard Comrie and others. Instead, our understanding of aspect as viewpoint is consistent with the history of the discussion. both within and outside Greek studies. Comrie in 1975 stepped away from that trajectory by analyzing aspect in temporal terms. The great irony of this statement is that Comrie is himself not a semanticist. He is a typologist. Typologists generally answer the question, what do a large swath of languages do? Rather than the question of the semanticist. What exactly does this mean? And certainly not the narrower question of the aspectologist. What exactly do aspect markers mean? He was not breaking new ground with his theory of aspect in 1976, as suggested by Campbell. Again, Campbell makes an incorrect statement about linguistics with 0 citations. There are also no citations given for his own theory of aspect from linguists. Robert Binnick's book, Time and the Verb, does provide us with the historical context of Comrie's book on aspect, to which he pays only moderate attention because, again, though I recommend Comrie's little book on aspect for beginners, he is himself not a semanticist. He gives the most thorough historical treatment of tense and aspect studies, beginning with the ancient Greeks, leading all the way up to the early 1990s, when the book was written. Regarding ancient grammarians, he says, the Stoics are generally considered to have essentially originated the Veronian theory and to have observed an aspectual distinction, complete versus incomplete action, cross-cutting the purely temporal one of past and present. It is debated whether the Stoic theory has its roots in Dionysius Thrax, the famous 2nd century BC Greek grammarian. But regardless, it seems as though at least some ancient Greek grammarians were aware of aspectual distinctions. They also did not define it spatially, but as essentially temporal. That is, it had to do with whether the action was viewed as complete or not. An incomplete is, of course, reference to just part of the event. A complete event is reference to the whole event. This is not to say that the Stoics had the same aspectual theory as the modern field of aspectology. They don't. But they certainly said nothing about it being spatial. And you can see the roots of the modern theory in the Stoic Veronian theory. Binnick also has a section on classical Greek grammarians and their view of aspect, to which I would refer you if you are interested in the history of the field, particularly placing it in the context of the wider world of linguistics. The most influential modern scholar who clarified and formalized the temporal concept of aspect is almost certainly the 20th century German philosopher Hans Reichenbach, whose terms speech time, reference time, and event time are still in use today from his 1947 work, Elements of Symbolic Logic. Campbell's discussion throughout this section simply fails to grapple with the linguistics literature, though claims about that literature are repeatedly made, again, without citations. It is true that theoretically, New Testament Greek scholars might be correct, and all the aspectologists and typologists, all those making a living off of determining what aspect is and how it is encoded in the world's languages, might be wrong. However, as I have tried to demonstrate, the linguistic theories are not just better because they are from linguistics. They are better because they account for the data. But the deeper issue is that Campbell does not cite any semanticists working on aspect in his entire book. The problem is that it does indeed seem that he is unacquainted with the people working on aspect in the linguistics world. And he misrepresents the field of linguistics to the world of biblical studies. And so we come to our last discussion in, again, what has been a very long review. Campbell uses Langacre in support of his view of tense. In discussing Langacre's view of tense, he says, while Langacre retains the terms present tense / past tense for English, he says their fundamental semantic characterization pertains to epistemic distance. Now that sounds like a solution. And guess what? It is also the solution I have put forward with respect to Greek. This discussion is about the problem of the past tense being used for counterfactual descriptions in Greek. In fact, this is common in a number of languages, including English, which is what Langacre is talking about. Campbell says that he is trying to say the same thing. If this is all that Campbell was trying to say with his remoteness terminology, I would happily agree with him. However, in Campbell's discussion of the aorist form and the feature of remoteness, he never once mentions the counterfactual reading in chapter 3. The only example he gave for remoteness in the chapter was Mark 1:11, where he discusses the verdicts coming from heaven. Again, I do not know how to interpret Campbell's description of this other than to say it is spatial, which is incorrect. He also talked about the aorist, covering a lot of ground and presenting events as less detailed. In his list of uses of the aorist in chapter 8, Campbell does not even give counterfactual as an option, though he does say that the aorist can be present and future. Again, the issue here is that the linguist Langacre is not saying what Campbell is saying he is saying. In the formal semantics literature, the Greek scholar Sabine Iatridou, a semantics professor from MIT, has worked on this problem in her article, The Grammatical Ingredients of Counterfactuality, published in 2000 or 2001. She essentially claims that, indeed, what we call the past tense morpheme is really not a past tense morpheme in the strict sense, but is a morpheme that refers to an exclusion feature. The basic idea is that the morpheme ed in English excludes something. Sometimes the thing excluded is the topic time from the time of the speaker, or the reference time as we have called it. This yields a past tense interpretation, since to exclude the time being discussed from the present time is to exclude it from the present moment. The counterfactual reading is treated in a very similar way, except that we are no longer discussing times, but possible worlds, which is the standard way of analyzing modals in semantics. In a counterfactual context, the world where the sentence is true is excluded from the world of the speaker, which is to say that the speaker considers the event description to be false. This unifies both uses of the past tense so that we can have a single meaning, plus exclusion, we'll call it, that accounts for all its uses. Iatridou in this article makes more precise Langacre's intuitions and builds on similar ideas, but neither scholar say anything about aspect being spatial or remoteness in level of detail. Their analysis is not the same as what Campbell said. This is how semantics is done today. We take the data, we make a hypothesis about the meaning of a morpheme to cover all the data, and then we refine our hypothesis and meaning based on more data. We're always trying to come up with theories that account for the data as best as possible. There has been a ton of progress on this in a wide variety of domains within linguistics. Tense and aspect have been some of the most heavily researched domains, and much progress has been made. Campbell fails to take into account all the advances that have been made in the field of linguistics. Ultimately, this led to incorrect analyses. What is equally troubling is that Greek students would have a warped view of the linguistics world from Campbell's book, a world which we can learn immensely from, and which has already worked out many of the grammatical problems students of biblical Greek have questions about. This has led to complaints that I have heard innumerable times about the field of linguistics having confusing terminology and being in a general state of disagreement and disarray. As someone who has benefited tremendously from semanticists, particularly in my exegesis of the Bible, I find this extremely unfortunate. I hope that through these videos, students and scholars start to see the value of the precision and clarity found in linguistics. There is no other field that provides us with more helpful tools for analyzing meaning than the field of semantics. Ultimately, our ability to articulate the meaning of words is inextricably linked to our exegesis of God's Word.